Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I wanted to bless you with a list of 5 builds that I think are going to perform exceptionally well in 1.0 as season starters. And with these 5 builds, I have one for each of the 5 classes, with an obvious emphasis towards the 2 brand new subclasses of Warlock and Falconer. However, the Warlock and Falconer build recommendations are simple theory crafts that I've done with the help of my Twitch chat. Please keep in mind that the builds might not work out at all. Primalist and Sentinel builds, however, are tried and true and will not let you down if you season start with them. The Mage build falls somewhere in between the two. It did receive multiple nerfs with 1.0, but I believe it should still be quite strong. Take all of these rankings with a grain of salt because 1.0 is not actually out yet. I'm going to include links to all 5 YouTube build guides and all 5 build planners in the description below. And now let's jump right in. Irashaimase! I'm gonna get us started with what I believe is the best Beastmaster build in the entire game right now. And it doesn't look like 1.0 is gonna change that. As you can see in the footage, this build deletes bosses. I was able to outperform the boss DPS of most of my other builds at level 85. If your party is lacking in single target damage, definitely consider this build as an option. The overall clear and performance of this build in monoliths is great as well. When you cast Earthquake, it spawns aftershocks and they seek out enemies, so it actually has a surprising reach compared to many other melee builds. However, it is still a melee build, so that makes it a little bit clunky for monolith clear. And compared to some other builds in last Epoch, you cannot off-screen enemies. In terms of tankiness, with optimized gear, you can get upwards of, let's say, 20,000 ward, combined with a lot of damage reduction from Beastmaster's passives, super high armor, and the result is one of the tankiest builds in the entire game. The only reason I didn't give it max score on tankiness is because it is melee. So you still have to be close range and put yourself in much greater danger than many other ranged builds in the game. If this was a ranged build instead, I'd definitely give it a 5 out of 5. And because of how well this build performs overall and how quickly it kicks in, I think it's one of the best season starters for Beastmaster. In the aspirational build planner that I have in the YouTube video, you'll notice that I have quite a few legendaries, but none of those legendaries are an absolute requirement. You can still clear all of the content in the game, Corruption 100 easily, and the legendaries and uniques are only going to allow you to push up higher and higher corruption. The playstyle for this build is you leap into the fray with Fury Leap, then you activate Frenzy Totem as well as Warcry for a bunch of buffs, and then you start alternating between Swipe and Earthquake while ensuring that your mana doesn't run out. Swipe is a utility skill that gives you mana regen, more damage multipliers, calling, as well as attack speed, while Warcry bunches enemies together for you, gives you extra damage, cleanses you, stuns enemies all around you, making your survivability even better. And the Earthquake setup is really cool as well. The damage over time from your Earthquake aftershocks scales with the number of totems that you have on the ground. So we min-max around that by utilizing Frenzy Totem, as well as adding just one idol that has a percentage chance to spawn a Thorn Totem on melee hit. So against bosses, you hit so many times, you easily spawn 2-3 Thorn Totems, which essentially doubles to triples your DPS. It's a super cool interaction that ESG have designed, so kudos to them. The itemization of the build utilizes one of the newer uniques in Cleaver Solution, which makes it so that your int is equivalent to your strength. And that simplifies our itemization, making it so that we can just stack strength to get tremendous benefits for both DPS and survivability. You can really feel your build and itemization progression as you go through monoliths and acquire more and more strength items and even some of the unique pieces in the gear setup. The only downside to season starting with this build is that Earthquake is not available until level 35. So I recommend not switching fully into Earthquake Swipe until you've invested into the 3 mana per hit points on Swipe, as well as after you've raised your Earthquake Aftershock damage with more multipliers. The switch might be up to your personal preference as well, so definitely keep Swipe and Earthquake on your bar and try them out every now and then, but until they feel smooth, you can always just run Thorn Totem. That setup doesn't require too many skill specializations to function well, leaving you a lot of room to work towards your Earthquake build. So if you're considering becoming a Beastmaster or Primalist enjoyer, this build is strongly recommended. Next up we have Paladin. And this is Volka's Enra's Technique crit-based build. And it is certainly one of the best, if not the best Sentinel builds out there. He has done a tremendous job with this build. So if you don't know him, go and check him out. Give him some love. And the build itself is kind of like the good old Hammerthrow, except your hammers don't spiral around you. You just send 6 of them with each attack in every direction around you. This build is not the fastest for bossing. It is somewhat slow for single target DPS, but that is because its specialty is in clear. You can wipe entire screens with your hammers, and they can even off-screen, making it a very powerful build for pushing monoliths because enemies don't even get to you. And the ones that do get mowed down by your hammers in no time. This is certainly one of the best builds to push monoliths with that Sentinel has available to them right now. The tankiness of the build is extremely solid. We run very high armor, max block chance with very high block mitigation from block effectiveness, reliable recovery thanks to throwing leech. What is holding the build back for tankiness is the existence of ward builds basically. If it wasn't for the existence of some ridiculously tanky ward builds, I would also likely give this build a 5 out of 5 on tankiness. It also doesn't have very many unique or legendary item requirements, making it an enticing choice for a season starter for Paladins. You don't want to spec into it right away. You probably want to level with Javelin and Holy Trowel. However, as soon as you have enough skill points in the Hammerthrow skill tree, you can consider respecking into it. Because remember, respecking in Last Epoch is fairly free. The playstyle itself is fairly smooth. You activate all of your buffs from Sigils of Hope. You always activate Holy Aura off cooldown. If you have stayed in one place for 2 seconds, you can activate your Volatile Reversal for an attack and movement speed, as well as a DPS boost against bosses. Smite can be used as your mobility skill, as well as utility to give you a little bit of extra damage, attack speed, cleanse, and healing. The Hammerthrow setup is really cool. We spec into Enra's Technique, which invalidates any spiraling or orbiting or chaining of our hammers in return for significant damage bonus, critical multiplier bonus, as well as base crit bonus, which all of these are invaluable for a crit-based build. And that is the node that makes this build work. Something else to consider about the build, Paladin is likely the class that gives the most buffs to allies around them in Last Epoch right now. The itemization that Volka has chosen is also really cool. First off, high armor. That's no surprise, especially given the new patch, making armor even stronger. That is going to be a staple for this build. But what I really appreciated in this build is the max block chance. Whenever I tested max block in the past, it never felt amazing. But in this build, Volka has managed to max out block chance without sacrificing too much health. And the result is, as you can see, you can tank pretty much every attack that Jorah has to offer, trivializing most aspects of boss fights despite the slow boss kill speed. You can even get health insurance by equipping Aurora's Time Glass Amulet, making you feel even safer. So if your party is lacking a Paladin, or you're nostalgic for some hammered in action, this might be the build for you. What I have for you for Runemaster is a Frostclaw Frostbite ailment build that pretty much every single content creator out there tried after Runemaster came out, because the build is fairly easy to execute on, was insanely powerful at the time, and I believe it's going to be just as strong in the new season. The 1.0 patch most significantly nerfed the permanent flame ward combination with Frostwall. It also nerfed a lot of the ward gain from the Frostclaw skill, as well as from the passives, as well as from the Raywind's Frostguard invocation. However, it also buffed Frostclaw in terms of mana generation, so you can likely get away with speccing into On Through the Snow for even more Frostclaw hits. I think your single target DPS on Frostclaw is going to go up with the new patch. Not to mention that Frostwall, even though it no longer gives us permanent flame ward, we can now get 14% more damage to chilled enemies instead of the old 5%. In terms of how this build performs, starting with bossing, it's great. You can see that I killed Jorah in 30-ish seconds. It will likely get faster with the new patch. Clear is absolutely amazing, in no small part due to Ice Barrage's off-screening potential. Ice Barrage is one of my favorite skills. You just cast it once, start running, and somehow everything around you dies. The tankiness was hit with 1.0, but I still believe it's going to be top tier tankiness, not to mention that you have significant range. We still have 30% damage reduction from Raywind's Frostguard, we still have phenomenal ward generation from Frostclaw. And while we don't have permanent flame ward, we can now focus on activating it on a per need basis. So once you get used to the flow of the game, you're never going to be in danger until you start pushing crazy high corruption. The only real downside to this build is when it comes to season starting, you require a few Frostbite specific uniques, namely Frostbite Shackles gloves and Snowdrift boots. So I would recommend you spec into this build after acquiring those two. Fortunately, both uniques drop from the exact same monolith boss, so it's not too hard to farm them up. And that's why I'm not giving this build the max score for season starter, but it is still a phenomenal build overall. In terms of the playstyle, Runic Invocation is both of our mobility skill, acting as a teleport, but it also activates Rainwind's Frostguard, one of the best skills in the game to tank up with. The role of Frostwall in the build is to be determined given some of the nerfs of Frostwall, but at the very minimum it should be able to give us 14% more damage. Flame Ward is our emergency button for when we bite off more than we can chew. You want to activate Ice Barrage whenever it's off cooldown because it gives you a massive boost to your cold DPS. So your Frostclaw does not deal nearly as much DPS when your Ice Barrage is off. And then Frostclaw is our spammable ability that applies even more stacks of Frostbite and takes care of tankier targets. It also generates ward as a function of how much freeze rate effectiveness you have. The itemization I already touched upon. You need a couple of uniques to make the Frostbite application feel good. Despite the nerfs to Twisted Heart of Eukaros, it's still probably best in slot. Another cool interaction to mention is that with the addition of Runemaster, EHG introduced the Runemaster passive, which essentially converts your armor shred into Frostbite chance. So that gave us an interesting stat line spec to go into in an effort to maximize our Frostbite chance. So make sure to take advantage of that one as much as you can. And honestly, one of my favorite parts about this build is that we stack so much freeze rate multiplier that we can proc freeze even on the nastiest endgame bosses like Jorah. So if you want flying icicle projectiles everywhere, freezing and frostbiting your enemies to death, this build is a great choice for you. Alright, and now we start getting into speculative territory. For Falconer, I have a build theory craft. However, I have absolutely no idea whether some of the ideas in the build are going to work exactly as I envisioned them. It is impossible to tell until it's tested in the live version of the game. Take these ratings with a massive grain of salt. But if everything works exactly as envisioned, I expect this build to be phenomenal for bossing, just because of all of the hits that Falcon Strike does against a single target, on top of all of the damage scaling effects in the tree, all of the more multipliers, it should stack up quite nicely. When it comes to clear, I don't think it's going to be nearly as good as bossing. However, it did seem like the Falcon Strikes had at least some AoE, so I expect the clear to be at least good. The mobility will definitely be top tier, between Shift having a very short cooldown thanks to Dive Bomb, the extra MS we get from Shift, from Falconry, and even various passives in the Falcon skill tree. This is going to be one zoomy build. If we get all the items that we want, tankiness should be a little bit easier to predict roughly where we're going to land, as long as there is no clunkiness when it comes to skill usage. I expect tankiness to be solid and reliable. I've given it 4 out of 5 here. We're going to be maxing Glancing Blow, high armor, high dodge for 1 second after shift, constantly moving, giving us damage reduction while moving, and also dodging all the attacks landing around us, having max endurance with solid endurance threshold. I am more comfortable with the tankiness rating that we have here than with some of the other ratings. With regards to how good the build will be for season starter, I rated it at 4 out of 5. And that is simply because there are so many more multipliers on the Falconry skill tree, as well as phenomenal scaling nodes. We should be able to get solid DPS out of it, even without extensive investment. But I could be wrong here, so please keep that in mind. The playstyle that we envision with this build. For monoliths, I expect us to be constantly activating Falcon Strikes and Dive Bomb whenever they're off cooldown. They shouldn't drain our mana too much, so we would be able to activate Explosive Trap here and there as well to boost our damage and our penetration for the Falcon. And then most of the time we can spend it just running with our character because we don't need to stand still and attack nearly as much in monos compared to versus bosses. If we are fighting a boss, however, I expect us to be able to stand our ground and spam Explosive Trap, Falcon Strikes, Dive Bomb, Smoke Bomb, and Shift whenever they're off cooldown And depending on how much mana sustain we have, I expect really solid DPS from just spamming all of those skills for a 5 to 10, 20 second period. The itemization utilizes some tricks here and there. Cradle of the Erased, comboed with one of the new Falconry passives, converts all of the block chance into Glancing Blow, making it super easy for us to max out Glancing Blow. We're also stacking Dexterity, so we can opt for Morning Frost, giving us even more DPS. Overall, the new Falcon class looks absolutely amazing. I don't necessarily think this is going to be the best Falcon build in the entire game. It is far too difficult to tell as of right now, but we'll see where things settle, and we'll see what kind of builds get developed over time. But if you want a build with an invulnerable minion that hits enemies 10-15 times per second, I definitely recommend this one. I also made a challenge with it because of the fact that I'm not going to be able to play it for a while. If anyone gets to play it and take down Jorah in an impressive 20 seconds, together with getting over 300 corruption, swing by my Discord and share your findings about the build. Last but not least, I've got a Warlock build for you. And Warlock is also a class that is coming out brand new in 1.0. So this is a build theory craft. I don't actually know how strong the build will be. If things work out as envisioned, I see this build as being fairly mediocre at bossing, because we can only apply a maximum of 1 stacks of Torment, which is our main source of DPS. And while that won't be a problem for monos, against tanky single targets, we might struggle a bit. I gave it a 3 out of 5, but it is possible that the build is 2 out of 5 as well, or even 1 out of 5. It's hard to predict, but I see this build as not being amazing against bosses. The clear, on the other hand, should be top tier, 5 out of 5. We have some really clear specific skills spec'd into the build. We're going to have great mobility with Ghost Flame, so clear should not be a problem. Tankiness is going to be great as well because of the ward and damage reduction and evasion that we get from Ghost Flame. So I see this build as being one of the tankier builds out there, as long as Ghost Flame actually feels smooth to use. Based on the videos that we've seen so far, it looked like the skates weren't very good at turning, so we'll see how it feels. This is also the build that I'm going to season start with in 1.0. And that's because I think it's going to be a really strong season starting build. We should be able to scale our clear and tankiness just by investing into necrotic resist and crit strike multi without the need for highly rare, unique or legendary items. The gameplay should be fairly straightforward as well. In monos, we mostly just cast Spirit Plague and Chthonic Fissure against large groups of enemies, and then we skate away with Ghost Flame. Chaos Bolt is going to activate itself, so we don't even need it on the skill bar. We can utilize Transplant to enhance our mobility even further and to hop over annoying cliffs so we don't have to skate around them. And then the playstyle against bosses, we will be more likely to just stand still, cast Rib Blood to accumulate a lot of spell damage, amping up the DPS of our Spirit Plague and Torment from Chthonic Fissure. If the boss is telegraphing an attack, we can always Ghost Flame for just a second and get tremendous damage reduction. So while boss fights might take a little bit longer, I suspect they won't be a problem whatsoever because of the tankiness of the build. Overall, I expect this build to be a really good introduction for anybody trying out Warlock for the first time. Could be a great build to farm up items for other Warlock builds that you want to try, or even to farm items for your future Lich or Necro builds. That's certainly my plan for the build, so if you are looking for a solid season starting build for Warlock, look no further. I think this build should be highly reliable and a great introduction to the Warlock class. And that is the list of 5 top tier builds, one for each class, that I wanted to share with you. I hope you get the chance to try at least one of these in 1.0. And if you disagree with any of these rankings, especially for the ones that are not theory crafted builds, please join my Discord and let me know so I can update my knowledge base accordingly. And as I mentioned, I'm season starting Warlock, so if you want to check out my progress, come and find me on Twitch. We regularly optimize builds that the rest of the community has not found out yet, and sometimes we end up with some of the best builds in the game. Best of luck for 1.0 everybody, Iron Jesus blessings, and Gochiso Samadeshta.